Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we take a huge stack of sources. And today, it's a really comprehensive profile on Vermont's history, its economy, its politics, and we just pull out the absolute key things you need to know about what makes a place tick.
And today, yeah, we're looking at Vermont, a state that I think for many people gets boiled down to, a few charming cliches.
Maple syrup.
Maple syrup, fall foliage, covered bridges, maybe a certain ice cream brand we all know. But if that postcard is all you see, you are missing the really radical heart of the place.
That's the perfect way to frame our mission here. We're using this detailed survey to unpack that fierce independence, its role as a sort of testing ground for progressive policies, and how its really unusual geography shaped everything.
From its politics to its very specialized economy, we really want to get into why the Green Mountain State is the way it is.
And why that matters. Yeah. So I think a good place to start is just the scale of it. Or maybe the lack of scale.
Exactly. Vermont is the 49th most populous state, so only Wyoming has fewer people. Its capital, Montpelier, is the least populous state capital in the entire country. It's got, about 8,000 residents?
It's tiny. And even its biggest city, Burlington, has a smaller population than the biggest city of any other state. It just completely subverts that American idea of, big urban centers and soaring buildings.
Right. And I love this fact from our sources. Vermont is the only state that doesn't have a single building taller than 124 feet.
That's amazing.
What's so fascinating is how a place so small, so landlocked, and so, sparsely populated has this huge reputation for being bold, both politically and socially. Our deep dive is all about finding the roots of that attitude.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where does this deep-seated independent spirit actually come from?
Yeah.
You don't just accidentally become a policy laboratory. We have to go back to the beginning, right? To this history of just aggressive self-determination.
And even the name tells you a lot about that streak. Vermont is just a French translation of Vermont.
Green Mountain.
Green Mountains, exactly. It was adopted in 1777, and the suggestion came from a man named Dr. Thomas Young, who was an ally of the very militia that defined the whole region, the Green Mountain Boys.
That's such a critical point. The state isn't named for a king or someplace in Europe. It's named after an illicit, armed vigilante group. Before it was Vermont, it was even briefly called New Connecticut.
And changing the name to Vermont in 1777, that was a statement. It cemented the influence of the Green Mountain Boys on the state's identity right from the start.
Before we get into all the colonial fighting, we should probably look back even further. 11,000 years, right as the glaciers were receding.
That's right. The first people there were Paleo-Indians. They were hunters. And the landscape included a saltwater body, the Champlain Sea, which eventually turned into the freshwater Lake Champlain we know today.
And the whole environment changed, right? About 8,000 years ago, you get the Archaic period. The big game like mastodons are gone, and people start relying more on smaller game, on plants.
Our sources really paint a picture of a very developed culture. Sophisticated fishing, stone cookware, food storage. It suggests, a pretty stable and successful indigenous society.
And then comes the woodland period, maybe 3,000 years ago, and that's when agriculture really takes hold.
Right, the three sisters, maize, beans, and squash. That allowed for larger, more permanent settlements. The main groups were the Algonquian-speaking Abenaki, and then bordering them you had the Mohicans and the Iroquois-speaking Mohawk.
And contact with Europeans in the 1600s was, it was a catastrophe, just like everywhere else. The diseases, things like smallpox, they just raced ahead of the actual settlers.
The estimates are devastating. Of the roughly 10,000 indigenous people in the area, somewhere between 75 and 90% died before any major European settlement even got started.
And the survivors were completely disrupted. They either had to move north towards French territory in Canada or try to assimilate.
And you see the legacy of that today. Vermont is unique in that it has no federally recognized tribes. The state itself has formally recognized several Abenaki bands, but not the federal government.
So the colonial era itself, after 1600, it's this kind of low-level competition. You have French military interests around Lake Champlain and English settlers creeping up the Connecticut River.
Then France gives up its territory to Britain in 1763 after the 7 Years' War, and boom, suddenly this huge forested land is up for grabs by the colonies to the south.
And this is the moment, this is the critical point that really defines Vermont's anti-authoritarian future. the land dispute over the New Hampshire grants.
It's a fantastic story. The New Hampshire governor, Benning Wentworth, he starts auctioning off huge areas of land between Lake Champlain and the Connecticut River back in 1749.
So settlers buy these grants, they set up towns, they think they have a clear legal title to their land.
But here's the problem. The colony of New York claimed the exact same territory. And in 1764, King George III issues a proclamation and sides with New York.
A disaster for the settlers.
A total disaster. New York immediately starts selling the land all over again, this time as land patents, to wealthy New York speculators. So people who had built homes, cleared farms, they're suddenly facing eviction by authorities backed by the king.
And this is where that independent spirit it takes a violent turn. The response wasn't to write a letter to the king. The response was Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys in the early 1770s.
And we have to be clear, this was not a formal army. This was an illicit, private militia whose entire purpose was to protect the New Hampshire grant holders from New York authorities by any means necessary.
Their methods were genuinely brutal. They used arson, mob violence, harassment. They'd kidnap and beat New York settlers and sheriffs to drive them out.
They were armed vigilantes, and they were successfully resisting colonial legal authority. That history of self-defense against what they saw as unjust government overreach, that fuels the state's identity even now.
And that internal fight perfectly prepared them for the bigger fight against Britain. The Green Mountain Boys got famous almost overnight when they captured Fort Ticonderoga in 1775.
A huge early victory in the Revolutionary War. It showed they were effective and just solidified their reputation for, decisive independent action.
All of this anti-authoritarian action leads directly to one thing: the Vermont Republic. January 15th, 1777. The representatives of the New Hampshire grants realized they're fighting New York and Britain, so they just declare full independence from both.
And what they wrote that summer, in a place called the Windsor Tavern, was revolutionary in the truest sense of the word. The Constitution of the Vermont Republic was, you could argue, the most radically liberal political document in North America at the time.
Absolutely. Think about the era. This Constitution was the first one in North America to explicitly ban adult slavery.
That's right. It had a provision that said male slaves were free at 21 and females at 18, a huge monumental step for the 1770s.
But maybe even more groundbreaking was the voting. The Vermont Republic granted universal adult male suffrage. They gave the vote to men who didn't own property.
Which was decades ahead of the rest of the United States. This little landlocked territory was experimenting with democracy on a scale that the big, powerful states were just too conservative to even try.
And they weren't just writing it down on paper. Vermont was a fully independent nation for 14 years.
A full-on nation. They had their own postal service. They issued their own coinage, the Vermont coppers, from 1785 to 88.
And the only reason it ended, that 14-year experiment, wasn't because they were defeated. It was just political necessity. They wanted to join the Union, but New York was still blocking them over the land claims.
The solution was purely pragmatic. In 1790, they reached a deal. Vermont had to pay New York $30,000 to settle all the outstanding claims.
So they literally had to buy their way into the Union.
They did. That payment cleared the way, and on March 4, 1791, Vermont became the 14th state, the very first one admitted after the original 13.
And that entire founding story resisting authority, governing themselves for 14 years, paying off their rival, it just left this permanent mark. A deep inherited skepticism of outside government control that you can still see in their policies today.
And that fighting spirit, moving into the 1800s, it got channeled into the Civil War. Vermont's contribution, for its size, was just astonishing.
Over 33,000 troops and more than 5,200 deaths. That's a casualty rate of over 15% of the soldiers they sent.
And it was also the site of the northernmost land action of the whole war, the St. Albans raid in October 1864.
This wasn't a battle, though. It was more like financial terrorism. About 20 Confederate agents crossed the border from Canada, robbed 3 banks in St. Albans, and then fled right back into Quebec.
And the local posse that chased them into Canada, a neutral country, caused this huge international incident.
Right, but it's interesting, the Canadian government eventually reimbursed the banks. They basically admitted their neutrality had been violated. It just highlights that unique position of Vermont, right up against an international border.
So the state inherits this tradition that's both radically democratic and, at the same time, violently anti-authoritarian. It's a complex heritage, but it's completely tied to the land itself.
That's a perfect transition. Let's move from that revolutionary history to the physical reality of the state.
If you connect the history to the geography, the key thing is that Vermont is the only landlocked state in New England. It's the easternmost landlocked state in the entire U.S.
It's geographically small, right?
Right.
About the size of a country like El Salvador. But the mountains, they just dominate everything.
The Green Mountains are the spine of the state, running north-south, and that spine divides everything up. You have the fertile Champlain Valley to the west, by the lake, and then the eastern side is all dominated by the watershed of the Connecticut River.
And those mountains dictate where people live, how they get around, the weather, everything. The highest peaks, like Mount Mansfield, they even have these rare alpine ecosystems above the tree line.
Speaking of the mountains, the geology is it's a cosmic story. The oldest rocks in the Green Mountains are nearly 1 billion years old. But get this, about 400 million years ago, those same peaks were estimated to be between 15,000 and 20,000 feet tall.
Wait, so as tall as the Himalayas are today?
Exactly. We are talking about Himalayan-scale mountains that have just eroded down over hundreds of millions of years.
Wow.
And you can still see the evidence of that geological violence. One of the most famous examples is the Champlain Thrust. It's a visible fault line where ancient bedrock was literally pushed up and over younger rock formations.
It's a classic example of tectonic pressure, I've read. Geologists love that spot.
They do. And if you want to go even further back in time, you can go to a place called Isle La Motte, an island in Lake Champlain. It holds the remains of the Chazy Formation.
Which was one of the world's very first tropical reefs.
One of the first. You can go to a quarry there and see 200-million-year-old marine fossils. It's this incredible reminder that this cold granite state was once part of Pangaea, floating in a tropical sea near Africa.
So the geology set the stage, and that stage dictates the climate. It's a humid, continental climate, right? Big seasonal swings.
Legendary winters, cold, long, snowy. You're looking at an average of 60 to 100 inches of snow.
And it's not the same everywhere. The Northeast Kingdom, that rural corner of the state, is way colder.
It is about 10 degrees Fahrenheit colder in the winter than the southern part of the state. So even within this small state, you have these distinct microclimates.
But that climate is changing, and the consequences for Vermont they're severe. Over the last 50 years, they've seen more rainfall and more intense storms, which leads to major flooding.
The Great Vermont Flood of 1927 was a generation-defining disaster, and we saw the modern version of that in 2011 with Tropical Storm Irene, which caused just massive damage.
And all this leads to the core economic threat, which is the warming trend. Warmer, shorter winters are predicted to have a catastrophic effect on the two things Vermont is most famous for.
Skiing and maple syrup. The ski season is already getting shorter, which hurts tourism, and the maple sugaring industry is facing an existential threat.
Why is that? What's the mechanism there?
Sugar maples need a very specific cycle of freezing nights and warm days for the sap to run properly. As winters get shorter and more erratic, that cycle gets disrupted. The trees are stressed.
So the trees themselves are in trouble.
Some research suggests the sugar maples are essentially being forced to migrate north into Canada to find the climate they need. This isn't just an economic problem, it's a threat to a core piece of their cultural identity.
This landscape, this climate, it also dictates how people live and how the state is governed. The urban structure is really unusual. Vermont only has 10 incorporated cities total.
And most of the population centers are legally towns. For example, the town of Essex has over 22,000 people, which is way bigger than many of the actual incorporated cities. The town meeting is still a huge part of their governance.
It's just so decentralized. It values small, local government over the big city political machines you see everywhere else. And that local control, it feeds right into their very unique economy.
Vermont's economy is this immediate contradiction. Its nominal GDP, about $45.7 billion, is the lowest of any state. But its GDP per capita is a very strong 21st in the nation.
Which tells you the economy isn't about massive volume. It's about small-scale industries making really high-value products or servicing, a very wealthy clientele.
And you can see that ethos perfectly in agriculture, even as traditional farming is in decline.
Dairy farming is a classic example. It's central to the state's image, right? The big white dairy barns everywhere. But the number of farms has just plummeted.
It's a nearly 95% decline between 1947 and 2021, just over 500 farms left.
And that's not just a number. That's a huge cultural shift in rural life. Right. The family farm is mostly gone. And now preserving those iconic barns is more of a historical project than an economic one.
And here's the paradox. While the number of cows has shrunk, the total milk production has actually doubled. It's all because of hyper-efficiency, better technology, better genetics.
So they're producing more milk with fewer cows on fewer farms.
Exactly. But even with that efficiency, their share of the bulk milk market is falling compared to giants like New York and Pennsylvania.
Forestry has a similar story. The state is 78% forested now, which is a huge comeback from the 1880s when it was mostly cleared for sheep pasture.
But the industry is struggling. The prices for wood products, lumber, and wood chips have been flat for decades. Our sources say the price for 1,000 board feet in 2017 was the same as it was in 1994.
So the forests are growing twice as fast as they're being cut. It's created a huge supply that keeps prices down.
And that pressure is what forced Vermont to adapt. They had to hyper-focus on high-value niche agriculture, and nothing symbolizes that better than maple syrup.
They are the dominant U.S. producer, no question.
They produce over half of the entire nation's supply, 2.55 million gallons in 2022. That's an industry worth nearly $60 million a year. And it's not a commodity, it's a premium brand.
Agritourism is another survival strategy. Apple growing is a big contributor, but consumer tastes have shifted away from the Macintosh apples that Vermont is known for.
So a lot of orchards have had to pivot. They now rely on pick-your-own experiences and making high-value hard cider to survive. It's all about leveraging that Vermont brand.
And Vermont brand is everything. It's like an economic shield. They have successfully monetized this idea of authenticity and quality.
Ben & Jerry's ice cream, Burton snowboards, Cabot cheese, King Walter flour, these aren't just companies. They're extensions of the state's identity, and they command premium prices because of it. That's how you get a high GDP per capita with a low overall GDP.
But let's set aside the pastoral image for a second. The single largest private employer in the state is GlobalFoundries.
Right, a semiconductor manufacturer in Essex Junction with 3,000 employees. So there is a significant high-tech manufacturing base, even in a state that's known for being expensive and highly regulated.
But the truly unexpected part of their economy, the thing that leverages their regulatory niche, is financial services. Specifically, captive insurance.
This is one of those concepts we really have to unpack. It's obscure, but it's hugely important to Vermont's economy.
So what is captive insurance, and why is Vermont a global leader in it?
Okay, so simply put, a captive insurance company is when a huge corporation or a group of them creates its own licensed insurance company just to insure its own risks.
So they become their own insurer instead of paying premiums to Aetna or State Farm.
Exactly. And they do it for control and for cost. It lets them bypass the volatile commercial market, it can lower their premiums, and it gives them huge tax advantages.
Okay, so why Vermont? Why not Delaware or somewhere else?
Because Vermont got in early and they did it right. They created a very flexible but robust regulatory environment. They have this deep pool of expert lawyers and accountants, and they can process applications way faster than their competitors.
The success is pretty staggering. By 2010, Vermont was the world's third largest home for captive insurance companies, right behind Bermuda and the Cayman Islands.
Over 900 of these companies are based there. It's a massive global financial footprint operating out of a tiny landlocked state. It's a brilliant exploitation of an intellectual regulatory niche.
And finally, let's look at infrastructure and energy, where the contradictions just keep coming. On paper, Vermont generates 99.9% of its electricity from renewable sources.
The highest in the nation. It's a fantastic number and a huge point of pride, but there's a huge caveat.
Which is that Vermont consumes about 3 times more electricity than it actually generates.
Exactly. So while the energy they make is green, they are a massive net importer of power, mostly from hydroelectric dams in Canada. So the energy independence story it's complicated.
And transportation is a huge liability. Half of the state's greenhouse gas emissions come from vehicles. It's a deeply car-dependent place.
Which is understandable given how rural it is.
Mm-hmm.
But the physical infrastructure itself is also a problem. Back in 2010, Vermont had the 8th worst bridges in the nation. Over a third were rated deficient or obsolete.
So you have this state that's a global financial hub, but is also struggling to just maintain its roads and bridges in a very harsh mountainous environment.
That's the perfect summary of the contradiction.
Okay, let's pivot from the economy to the people themselves, the Vermonter persona. And we have to start with the demographics of homogeneity.
It is consistently one of the least racially and ethnically diverse states in the U.S. About 92.2% of the population identifies as white, non-Hispanic. Only Maine is whiter.
But even within that homogeneity, there are distinct threads. The largest ancestral group is French, right? about 20% of the population.
Which makes perfect sense given the history and the proximity to Quebec.
And the population trends are really key to understanding modern Vermont. Inward migration really slowed down in the 2010s, but then it reversed sharply in the early 2020s.
It did, and this is a pattern. The big influx of domestic migrants in the 1960s and 70s was a critical turning point for the state.
These were the so-called back-to-the-landers.
Right. Often highly educated people escaping the cities, looking for a simpler life. And they brought with them fundamentally different political and social ideas than the native-born, moderate Republican population. That collision of worldviews is what set the stage for the state's huge political shift.
So let's talk about how Vermonters sound. The local dialect is Western New England English.
And the key thing is that they pronounce all their R sounds. It's what linguists call a rhotic accent, which sets them apart from the classic non-rhotic Boston accent where you pock the ka.
And there's another quirk, right? Especially the rural areas. The glottal stop for the letter T.
That's right. So you might hear some rural speakers drop the T sound at the end of a word, so Vermont sounds more like Vermont. It's a very subtle regional marker.
And because of Quebec, French is still the second most spoken language in Vermont homes, one of only 3 states where that's the case.
Right, the local dialect is New England French, which comes from Quebec French.
Moving on to the spiritual landscape, Vermont always ranks as one of the most secular states in the country.
The data is really striking. As of 2022, a plurality of the population, 48%, identified as religiously unaffiliated, no religion, agnostic, atheist.
And only 45% identified as Christian, with Catholicism being the largest single group within that.
This high rate of secularism, it creates an environment where there's just less institutional religious resistance to progressive social policies like same-sex marriage or cannabis legalization.
And finally, let's look at health and safety, because there's a real paradox here. By many measures, Vermont is a national leader. It was ranked #1 for health outcomes in 2010. It has low violent crime rates.
It seems idyllic, but the substance use numbers tell a very different story.
Vermont leads the nation in the rate of young people who've consumed alcohol in the past month.
And it was ranked second for marijuana use among young people. About 30% of adults aged 18 to 25 reported using it in the past month.
So you have this paradox, a state that's safe, healthy, and well-educated, but also struggles with substance use among its youth at rates that are far above the national average. It's a complex problem that really defies the postcard image of Vermont.
It certainly does, and that complexity is front and center in its politics.
The political history of Vermont is one of the most remarkable transformations in the country. We talked about its founding, but even in the modern era, the shift has been just tectonic.
For most of its history, from 1856 all the way to 1988, Vermont was the most reliably Republican state in the entire country.
In that whole 132-year period, they only voted for a Democrat for president once. Lyndon Johnson's landslide in '64.
But since 1992, it has completely flipped. It's now one of the most reliably Democratic states. And that is a direct result of that cultural clash we talked about, the old, moderate Republican base blending with the influx of liberal domestic migrants from the 60s and 70s.
And that created this unique political ecosystem that welcomes non-traditional candidates.
Yes.
And you can't talk about Vermont politics without talking about Bernie Sanders.
Exactly. An independent, a self-described democratic socialist who has represented Vermont for decades. His success just speaks to a political culture that cares more about ideology and personality than it does about strict party labels.
And this fluidity, this willingness to experiment, combined with its small size, has let Vermont act as a progressive policy laboratory for the whole country.
The list of legislative firsts is just profound. In 2000, it was the first state to create civil unions for same-sex couples, but then they went further.
In 2009, they became the first state to legalize same-sex marriage through a vote of the legislature, not a court order. They even overrode the governor's veto to do it.
And that boldness just continues. In 2018, they were the first state to legalize recreational cannabis through legislative action, not a voter referendum.
They led on consumer issues, too. In 2014, they were the first to mandate the labeling of GMOs in food.
And on national politics, they are still channeling that anti-authoritarian spirit. In 2014, Vermont became the first state to officially call for a constitutional convention to overturn the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision.
That shows a real willingness to challenge the highest legal authority in the country, right from the state level.
And this progressive tendency is backed up by some very strict regulations, all designed to protect the landscape that defines the state. The most famous example is Act 250.
Act 250 is a legendary piece of legislation. It was passed in 1970 to limit major development and stop suburban sprawl.
It basically says any big development has to go through this intense environmental review process.
And the result of that is clear. Vermont was the last state in the nation to get a Walmart. They made a conscious choice to prioritize their small-town image over unchecked commercial growth.
And that dedication to aesthetics, it extends to the roads. Vermont is one of only 4 states, along with Alaska, Hawaii, and Maine, that has completely banned advertising billboards.
They just see them as visual pollution that ruins the scenic views that are so crucial to their tourism economy.
And you see it in their environmental policy, too. They have a strict ban on spreading manure in the winter to prevent agricultural runoff from polluting the waterways.
Which puts real economic pressure on those struggling dairy farms, but they do it to protect the water quality, especially in Lake Champlain.
Now, here's where the contradictions get really interesting. Despite this image of progressive regulation, Vermont has some striking regulatory quirks, especially when it comes to personal liberty.
You're talking about gun laws.
I am. It's a genuine outlier. A reliably blue state with some of the least restrictive gun laws in the entire country. No permit needed to buy or carry a firearm. Open and concealed carry are legal for anyone over 16.
Which connects all the way back to that 250-year-old tradition of the citizen militia and the Green Mountain Boys.
Exactly. Another contradiction is taxes. The property tax burden is among the highest in the nation relative to income.
And that is largely because of a very controversial law called Act 60, the education funding law. We should probably explain this.
We should. The goal of Act 60, passed in '97, was to create equity in school funding so students in poor towns had the same resources as students in wealthy towns.
And the mechanism was redistribution.
The state pooled local property taxes from everyone and then redistributed the money based on the number of students in each town. This meant wealthy towns were, in effect, subsidizing schools in poorer towns.
And that created huge resentment. So much so that the town of Killington, a wealthy ski resort town, actually tried to secede from Vermont and join New Hampshire over the tax burden.
It's the modern version of the exact same anger that fueled the Green Mountain Boys, resisting what they see as an unjust external authority taking their money.
And finally, let's touch on one last unique law that ties back to that fierce individualism: the law protecting public nudity.
It's true. The state's constitution has been interpreted to protect public nudity as a right, as long as it's not lewd and lascivious.
And the context here is fascinating. It was done in part to protect the long-standing tradition of skinny dipping in the state's many secluded swimming holes.
So it's a legal protection for a harmless personal liberty, which contrasts so sharply with the strict environmental laws like Act 250.
So you have a state where you can start a global insurance company. You have to store your cow manure all winter. You're constitutionally protected to go skinny dipping. And you can open carry a handgun without a permit. All of it happening under the gaze of mountains that were once taller than the Himalayas.
That pretty much sums it up.
So what does this all mean? When we look at this deep dive into Vermont, the pattern is just. It's unmistakable. Its small size and its challenging geography have fused with this radical, inherited commitment to self-determination.
We saw that independence in the original Vermont Republic, banning slavery, establishing universal male suffrage before the U.S. even did. And you see it today in their willingness to be a policy pilot program for the country.
Whether it's social legislation or strict land use policy like Act 250, they're often just leaping ahead of bigger, more politically stuck states.
It's fascinating how the Vermont brand works so well precisely because they use regulation, like the billboard ban, to aggressively defend that sense of authenticity. They legislate to protect the very identity they sell to the rest of the world.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, Vermont's history of self-determination, combined with its geographic isolation and small population, lets it bypass the kind of political inertia that just bogs down larger states. This turns it into a functional, if maybe limited, policy laboratory for the nation. For you, the learner, this raises a really important question. Does a smaller scale and a strong unified identity, rather than just size or wealth, define a state's capacity for political innovation? Think about the challenges of trying to scale Vermont's local successes, like its tax distribution or its growth limits, to larger, much more diverse populations across the rest of the country.